We might get started. I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to see everybody. We have been planning this symposium for quite a while, and we've had many stops and starts, but it's just wonderful to see everyone here. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Justine Lloyd from the Department of Sociology at Macquarie University, and also a member of the Centre for Media History. So just before we start, I wanted to acknowledge country. So I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which Macquarie University is situated, the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continued to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to the Darug people and the Wallumattagal clan. We also wish to acknowledge the elders of the Darug Nation, past, present and emerging, and pay our respects to them. We further wish to honour and pay our respects to the ancestor and spirits of this land, and humbly ask that all members of the Macquarie University community and everyone here present today are granted with the capacity to Wingara, to think, to learn and walk safely upon this Pemel, this land. The university continues to develop respectful and reciprocal relationships with all Indigenous people in Australia and all other Indigenous peoples throughout the world. I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty has not been ceded in Australia and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So if you would like to acknowledge country yourself, you can do that through the chat. We'd love to know where you're joining us from and what country you're working on. Just to explain how the session will work, so today we're going to have a panel. We called it a morning panel, but by the time we get to the panel, it should be the afternoon, be after midday. But first, we have a opportunity to have a keynote from Safdar Ahmed, and my colleague Charm will introduce Safdar in a minute. Safdar is one of the artists who's part of the exhibition that we have been working on for over 2.5 years, I think, by the time we went through the pandemic as well. And Charm will explain a little bit about the exhibition just before Safdar speaks. Just want to explain that we're recording the session and we will put it up on the Centre for Media History YouTube, so it will be accessible there. Because we have quite a few participants today, we're not going to turn on the microphones, but we'll do the questions and answers through the chat. So be ready to post your questions in the chat. And I just want to, before we start, also give thanks and acknowledgement to a huge number of people who've been incredibly helpful and supported this event and the exhibition over these long couple of years. So I just want to thank the Centre for Media History, particularly the director John Potts and the former director Virginia Madsen. Also Administrative Officer Kate Manlick, I think, is joining us today as well. Also like to thank the Activism, Rights and Justice stream at Macquarie University in the Faculty of Arts, particularly Amy Barrow and Sarah Fuller, who've been having conversations with us all the way along. At the Faculty of Arts, particularly Erin Claringbold for the support that she's given to the exhibition and a series of events which we had planned but have moved online. And also the School of Social Sciences, especially Ben Spies-Butcher, who's the head of sociology, who is really supportive of this idea from the very beginning. The University Art Gallery itself, and Rhonda Davis and Kate Hargraves. And Rhonda will be chairing Bonnie Jurick's panel this afternoon, or Bonnie Jurick's keynote this afternoon. So thanks to Rhonda. Also to Alex Ettling, who's going to be convening the panel this afternoon and has put together such an amazing panel of speakers. If you've missed out on tickets for the afternoon panel and you would like to come, please email us and we'll be able to give you the link. If the tickets have already closed this morning, but we welcome you there. And I'd like to thank all the artists of the exhibition. So Safdar is here, also Nikki Minus and Sam Wallman, who have been very generous, and you will be able to see their work at the art gallery if you come down very shortly when we reopen, and also to all the speakers who are here today, so all the panel presenters. But I won't take up any more time, and I'll hand over to Chan, who's now going to introduce Safdar.
Thank you, Justine. Hi, everyone. My name is Can Yalçınkaya. I'm a program manager at Macquarie University International College and also a member of the Center for Media History at Macquarie University. And as Justine mentioned, I just wanted to talk a bit about our exhibition before I introduce Safdar very shortly. So the exhibition is titled Panels That Transform, Comics and Activism. And it features 3 artists, as Justine mentioned, Safdar Ahmed, Sam Wallman, and Nikki Minus, featuring all the new works from these artists. We've been working on this exhibition since I think about the end of 2019, or like maybe early, like end of 2018 even, when it was sort of first came to us as an idea. However, of course, with the pandemic, we've had to postpone it for a year. And then just as we installed the exhibition around June 2021, this year, of course, we were hit with another lockdown right before we were able to open the exhibition, which was unfortunate. So there was lots of uncertainty about what will happen with the exhibition. However, we just had news yesterday that the exhibition will open on the 11th of November. And I mean, we will be able to, I think we won't be able to open it to guests on the 11th. However, after that, it will open 3 days a week from Wednesday to Friday between 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Every week up until December. So if you have some time to visit the exhibition on those days, Wednesday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. After the 12th of November, please do so or let us know. Just as a note, anyone who visits the exhibition will have to show proof of double vaccination before they enter. Okay, so before I keep going on with all this stuff, I just want to introduce Safdar Ahmed, the keynote speaker for today's first session. So Safdar Ahmed is a Sydney-based artist and academic in the field of Islamic studies. He's the author of Reform and Modernity in Islam, and also the graphic novel Still Alive, which was published by 12 Panels Press this year. His drawings and comics have appeared in such publications as The Guardian, Overland, Mianjin, The Lifted Brow, and he is a founding member of the community art organization, the Refugee Art Project, for which he conducts regular art workshops with asylum seekers and refugees in Western Sydney. In 2015, Safdar won a Walkley Award in the artwork category for his documentary webcomic Willowwood, Notes from an Immigration Detention Center. And today, Safdar will be talking about graphic journalism and the problem of witnessing. Over to you, Safdar.
Thanks so much, Jan. Hi, everyone. My name's Safdar Ahmed. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Guringai people in what is otherwise known as the northwest parts of Sydney, in Hornsby. So I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners, past and present, recognizing that sovereignty was never ceded. I'm going to go to screen share and take you through some images and talk about the graphic novel. Is that working? Okay. So in this talk, I want to go through some of the choices that went into making this graphic novel and some of the issues that it tries to deal with in terms of notion of witnessing and representation in relation to the refugee issue. I'd start by saying we are all, in a sense, bystanders or witnesses to the spectacle of Australia's detention regime, in which people of asylum seekers and refugees are subject to indefinite incarceration as a form of punishment and deterrence for coming to Australia. particularly by boat. This is, of course, something which Amnesty International described as fitting the international definition of torture with relation to Australia's offshore processing. And it's a spectacle in the sense that our offshore and onshore detention systems for over 20 years have been a politically orchestrated campaign, if you like, of images, perceptions, and a theatre of punishment for which there is no security rationale, nothing to do with processing people, and no justification in terms of, you know, the idea of process. So today, of course, you know, at present, the contract on Nauru is being renewed. So offshore processing will continue, according to the present government. Saeed Imasi is a stateless man who has lived in detention now for 11 years, mostly in the onshore detention system. So I don't think any of us can claim, you know, innocence. We're all sort of implicated in this system. And to describe the camp here, I'd echo Agamben's language, Giorgio Agamben, who described it as an absolute biopolitical space. And I think he used this, I think this is relevant to Australia's detention camps in the sense that there's no clear spatial or political limitations to what the camp can be or what it can do. When the Keating government began mandatory detention in the 1990s, it was done back then for the same sort of politically motivated reasons that we have now, albeit the form has evolved over the years, becoming crueler and more punitive, you know, over time. And so there's a sense in which, because this is politically motivated, because there's no actual justification for it, that, you know, it seems as though the concept of it, border protection, and the means to punish people are sort of, you know, inexhaustible. It's always mind-boggling how cruel the whole system becomes. So the question of representation came up. I think it's a question that philosophers talked a lot about after the Holocaust in relation to witnessing, and how this sort of extra legal system, to go back to Agamben, this idea of sovereignty which punishes people outside of the law, can be represented. So I published Still Alive earlier this year in April, and it's based on my personal experiences of visiting Sydney's Villawood Detention Centre to conduct art workshops on behalf of Refugee Art Project, which is the non-profit community art organisation that I founded with some friends over about 10 years ago. And so the aim of that group was we started just by going into Villawood, making friends and having community gatherings. It was an art circle where we would all draw together. And the intention of the organisation is to centre refugee voices. It's to support the creative self-expression and cultural agency of the people we met. And within the first few months, we had a nice circle of people and a community that was formed. And then in collaboration with those people, we would curate exhibitions, present the work online. We've self-published about 10 zines to sort of take the artwork to the community and hopefully dispel some of the misconceptions around the refugee issue. I stopped going to Villawood about 2017. I think at that point I just burnt out and ran out of emotional energy. But we've had a community studio as well since 2011, and have met very regularly to keep talking, sharing food, making art with the people we initially met in detention. And that's been going continuously and is still going. We've got a studio at the moment in Ashfield's Thurning Villa. So most of those we met in Villawood were from such countries as Afghanistan, Iran, Sri Lanka, then Iraq, Syria, and Myanmar. And on average, most of the people we knew were locked up for about 2 years, some for as long as 5 or 6 years. We'd go regularly with pencils, food, that sort of things. And I should emphasize that the aims of community engagement, when you're doing community art and cultural development, it really isn't about the work per se. It's about the process. It's about, I guess artists would call it relational aesthetics, bringing everyone together to create an environment of safety and friendship where people feel safe enough to express themselves on their own terms. And so that was what that was all about. Here's some drawings made in Villawood by my friend Anton, who's brilliant at fisheye perspective drawings by hand, you know, which he just does on the spot. And so that's a drawing of us all sort of sat around a table in the visitors area of Villawood, made back in 2013. That's the old visitors area, by the way. They've since renovated the detention center. So it doesn't look like that today. So I'll talk a little bit about socially engaged art, because this is something that I feel very strongly about. And this is something which I think contains principles that are crucial for any sort of collaboration or solidarity when people engage with communities, of particularly marginalized communities. I would say that socially engaged art is basically about working together to express the values and needs of that community, more so than to please some theoretical observer or outsider. And I take my thoughts on this from Tanya Bruguera, who points out that in community engaged work, there's a horizontal situation. There shouldn't really be any particular leader or artist. It's different to the European paradigm of aesthetics, which privileges the role of the spectator or viewer, or of the neoliberal art market with its cult of the artistic genius, you know, who can sort of turn their telescope to any sort of social or political issue and illuminate it. It's not really about that. It's not about using people as a vessel to sort of express the creative genius of the sort of the artist or director. It really is about everyone collectively deciding and agreeing on what should be done and doing it more on the terms of that community. With socially engaged art, I think, oh, here's some panels, by the way, from Villawood, which tries to sort of touch on the ethics as well of engaging in storytelling or any sort of creative collaboration where the subject matter might be a little bit traumatic or triggering for a person. Again, it's not about the art. I think safety and having fun comes first. And so here we are drawing, and this person doesn't feel like it, has a headache, and we drop it, you know. And often that was the case. When we had a studio in Parramatta, there was a whole period of about 6 months where no one did any art. We were just having barbecues every weekend. And I think that was what, you know, that called for at that time. So socially engaged work, oh, here I say a core aim of the collective of Refugee Art Project is to present narratives and images which also exceed the frame of refugee, because it's actually very dehumanizing to be telescoped through a singular lens. And often the category refugee is very limiting. Of course, it's dehumanizing to be criminalized and objectified by right-wing discourses that portray refugees as somehow doing the wrong thing, as coming here illegally. The political discourse, which demonizes refugees on the whole, but also even amongst refugee supporters, the discourse that says, you know, that refugees need to be helped, they have so much to offer and so on, can be equally reductive because it doesn't take into consideration the whole sort of depth and complexity of human experience. So with Refugee Art Project, the artwork was not streamlined to express this single issue or to reinforce this single category of refugee. I think it showed an amazing variety of depth and complexity. Here's an artwork by Saeed from 2014 called Freedom is Very Expensive. So I think with socially engaged work, as I said, I think it should be about satisfying the community or the people who are making it, not some theoretical observer. I think in the neoliberal art market, lots of people want socially engaged work to be somehow uplifting. They want it to share the same aesthetic. They want to consume it in 5 minutes and feel good about it, but I don't think it has to ever cater to those expectations. It often takes a lot of time, and I think can be very, complex, but it should be made to satisfy the needs of that community. There's also the danger that socially engaged art can be repackaged and sold as inspiration porn, in this sort of neoliberal art world or information world, where often people want to present uplifting or hopeful messages. This is just probably the worst example I could think of. The Hungarian photographer Norbert Baxter, who did a photo shoot with a model posing as a refugee in 2015. It was some sort of example of refugee chic trying to, aestheticize, romanticize, whatever you like. It was a very kind of appropriative take on the issue, just in bad taste as well. So yeah, I would say that basically social media as well is a very important tool for refugees and asylum seekers to connect, but also to sort of present their own voices. And there's been some research on this, and a lot of the stuff we did actually was via social media. Facebook was crucial for keeping in touch with people, talking about what's going on. Linking to other people and other refugee supporters or people who might help with legal stuff and that sort of thing. Also crucial for people in offshore detention. So a collaboration in my book with Amir Taginiu was made entirely through social media and Facebook and then Telegram. Here's a comic by Haider Ali. So because I love comics, I was very inspired by a movement in India actually called Comics Power. And that was founded by Sharad Sharma, and they've been around for about 10 years. And they go to villages and work with marginalized communities in India. And they give them comic workshops where they teach them to tell a single story in one page with black and white, with pencil and biro. So it's very simple, but it often allows people to express points of view which can then be sort of photocopied in the local corner shop very cheaply and stuck in the public square. And so they've worked with Dalits, they've worked with, marginalized groups in India, women's prisons. They've done workshops in Bangladesh and Pakistan. And so that was a very inspiring project, which also empowers people through the language of visual narratives to sort of talk about their situation. And so in Villawood, we started doing little comic workshops where, again, lots of people did these short vignettes about life in detention. And that was very inspiring. That was one of the things that inspired me to do the graphic novel as well. And this is my favorite, just to stay on Refugee Art Project for 1 second, this is my favorite collaboration by far. One thing as a community organization we started to resent was the way institutions would partner with us, which is fine. They'll partner with us, they'll pay for a course or something. And so maybe we'll do an 8-week workshop, but there was always the expectation at the end of that there would be an exhibition or a book or some kind of deliverable to show for the funding. And we became a bit tired of the pressure to bring it forth deliverables. And so the best things that happened were often totally spontaneous, totally unplanned, totally unfunded. And this is one of those examples. In our Parramatta studio, Majid Rabet, who's a very good friend, who I met in Villawood, he's an engineer and an inventor. he was working away in our Parramatta studio. And I was actually there one day with John, who introduced me, also my friend and bandmate. And we were just jamming. And then suddenly Magic came next door and was like, oh, yeah, I love heavy metal in Iran. I used to listen to Black Sabbath when I was a teenager. And suddenly his inner teenager lit up and connected with my inner teenager. And then he said, oh, I'll make a guitar for you guys. So I was like, okay. So I gave him one of my old guitars, and he completely sculpted it and refashioned it for our band. And so he's made the skull, he's completely redone all the wiring, he's fixed the pickups. It works better than it ever did. And it's just a beautiful, unique object. And that's the kind of thing which just happened absolutely spontaneously, because we had the studio space and the luxury of time. And sometimes for community work, that's sort of all you need, you know? For me, that was often more important than the money and then the pressure of deliverables or what have you. Just a chance for things to happen organically and spontaneously. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about graphic journalism. A big founder of graphic journalism is Joe Sacco, whose book Palestine, I think, is very important. And what really impressed me about graphic journalism is that it clears a space to engage in practices that are critical and self-reflective. The other example here on this page is by Kate Evans, who also did an excellent book called Threads from the Refugee Crisis, about the camp that existed near the train line that goes between England and France, the so-called jungle in Calais. Graphic journalism, what I love about it, what I love, for instance, about Sacco's work, is that he places himself in the frame. He often draws his interactions with the people he meets, his relationships with sources, with fixers, with everyone around him. And I think what's special about that is he still tells very powerful stories, but there's the context of his engagement with that environment, how people respond to him, you know, how some people might try to impress him because they think as a journalist he has certain powers. I think often there's a lot of misconceptions about what the media can do. And so this way of putting the journalist into the narrative frame and making that a part of the work, I think is a very good way of showing, for instance, that there really is no objectivity in journalism. This idea of a neutral space doesn't exist. And too often, I think mainstream journalism falls into the mistake of striving for objectivity in a way which is very harmful, because some situations demand a clear-eyed moral response. You know, there's no point having a panel in which you bring on an anti-racist activist or someone talking about the effects of racism, and then you know, set them up against a neo-Nazi or someone. You know, that's not balance or objectivity. Yeah, too often I think that's the situation, you know, and so, yeah, this type of journalism, this really struck me as being a way for journalism to both tell the story, but also critique and be critically aware of its own role, you know, its own production, its own creation. And I think this comes from and stems from a tradition in underground or independent comics, which is often heavily autobiographical and which is shot through with what Charles Hatfield called ironic self-authentication. Now, the term autographic is a recently minted term, and I think it describes pretty much a process of self-representation, which is also, if you like, complicated and self-aware, right? So when Hatfield talks about ironic authentication, I think he refers to a process in which, for instance, the artist draws themselves into the story or writes themselves into it in a way that sort of alerts us to the fictive qualities, perhaps, or the editorial ways that stories are put together. So we realize you're not getting a God's eye view, you're getting a very human view. There's a lot of self-irony and a lot of undermining in this tradition of comics, a lot of self-criticism, sometimes borders on a type of humorous self-loathing. Here's a panel by Aileen Kaminsky-Crum in which she's talking about her sort of self-esteem issues. And there's some really powerful feminist works of autobiographical comics. Another big favorite of mine is Julie Doucet, the French-Canadian artist, and her Dirty Plot series. So yeah, I think this is a very strong tradition, which also informs my approach. Here's a little anecdote from Villawood. A small example of what I'm talking about in terms of why I thought it was necessary to put myself in the frame. It wasn't just to fulfill the sort of standard documentary mode where there's a host, you know. The standard documentary format is, I'm your host, I don't know anything about this issue, I'm going to go into this place and you're going to relate to me because you don't know anything either, and you'll follow my journey and you'll learn about this subject. I didn't want it to be that kind of documentary mode. I wanted it to be a bit deeper than that, perhaps in the tradition of someone like Sacco. This is just an anecdote about a time we brought food into the center. Home-cooked food, Afghan and Iranian food. And I think the mostly men in Villawood at the time hadn't had anything even remotely, you know, to remind them of home. And so it unleashed a kind of frenzy, and everyone was really excited and went for it. And maybe our mistake was not to have kind of, you know, served plates and handed it out in an orderly fashion. And so at the time, I felt like it was just sort of out of control. You know, people were just going wild. One person piled up a plate like this high, and I thought, how sweet, he's taking it for a friend. Then I realized it was all for him. And so that made me a bit upset, a bit angry. And I think the point of this anecdote, silly and trifling though it is to try and show that detention, I think, doesn't produce heroes. No one comes out of detention looking good. Everyone's in this situation. There's a lot of lateral violence. There's a lot of, you know, frayed nerves. And even for myself, you know, I was very pissed that day because I sort of like, oh my God, you know, there was a chocolate cake and one guy just sort of grabbed it with his hand, and and so it brought out the worst in me too. And so anyway, this is just a small anecdote and a way of showing an attempt to do the autographic thing, to say that I'm not some objective observer with a God's eye view of this detention center. I'm visiting too, and showing some of those interactions, which I think is important. Now I want to talk about the question of representation. It was important to be critical of framing, media framing, and the ways this issue is conventionally presented to us, and to critically engage with what Professor Anne Carden-Coyne calls displacement aesthetics, which I think is the conventional way migrant or refugee narratives are presented to us. Commonly, it's a three-stage journey. You know, it's presented as the point of departure. Maybe there's some hardship in the home country. So people leave. There's the journey, which is often, you know, another ordeal on top of that. And then there's the arrival. And this conventional way of framing the migrant or refugee narrative usually tries to bring resolution to those three stages. You know, the third stage usually includes some idea about assimilation or new beginnings, as though the sort of the ordeal has been wrapped up and everyone's now happy that they're living in Australia. And so I think this type of aesthetics and this way of framing isn't, you know, is again, I think it's packaged in a way that makes people feel good, but real life contains ruptures and traumas that aren't so easily resolved. And so I wanted my comic to challenge both the pejorative stereotypes of refugees as queue jumpers or what have you, as well as the well-intentioned ways people frame refugees as being sort of people just like us, people who are human, people who have so many good things to contribute. So here's a little passage where I talk about that. I say sometimes refugees are held up in a positive light. Yes, it's true they've been award-winning athletes, surgeons, comedians. They've shown incredible resilience to escape from persecution and survive their journeys. They have so much to offer. But these factors should never condition their acceptance. People who have been through hell do not have to be angels. They do not have to benefit anyone. So this is also a way, I think, of short-circuiting the way that when we talk about witnessing, there's often this political distinction between the victim whose suffering matters or should matter to us and the ones who do not. A distinction between the good refugee and the bad refugee, you know? And unwittingly, I think sometimes refugee supporters fall into that frame when they talk about all the positive things that refugees bring. It sort of creates this image of the good refugee, the skilled person who has so much to offer our society. I find this really infuriating because ultimately any consideration, whether that's taken by the government or even Joe Blow on the street, shouldn't care for that. I mean, basically people have basic human rights, and that should be the baseline for their acceptance, not what they have, you know, to offer us or to offer the country or whatever. Oh yeah, sorry, that finishes with another self-reference. Most will be as ordinary, lazy, flawed, and as unimpressive, or you and I. And that's me in the morning, sort of scratching my privates in bed. Yeah, so in a way, I'm trying to use comics. It's the underground tradition of comics, which is often quirky, a bit satirical and irreverent, to try and make these points. And I'll talk in a moment also about the different visual languages that I try to use to sort of, again, escape from the documentary mode and make this a little bit more complex and multi-layered.
Excuse me, Safdar, we will have to, I think, wrap up in a few minutes. To have
oh, great. Already. Yeah. Okay, no problems.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so I'll skip through. This is talking about the fact that consent is an ongoing process. The main character in my book is Haider Ali, who's a good friend. And I showed him all of the chapters with his story many times over as the work emerged. And the page here on the right is me showing him the final draft when it was still being touched up and revised, you know? And so I felt it was important to also show that process of the work's creation and that conferring, and the fact that, you know, consent isn't just a box you tick at the beginning of a project and then leave and forget about. Bearing witness, let me say that there is a real problem. Witnessing can sometimes be extractive and voyeuristic, right? And for me, a wonderful example of that is this Mervyn Peake drawing called The Consumptive. Peake went to Germany with the British Army as a war artist in 1945, and he entered the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where he did this drawing of a young Jewish girl who was dying of consumption, dying of tuberculosis. And he sat at the foot of her bed and drew her in the final hours of her life. And he then wrote a poem called The Consumptive, which I think is very self-critical. I think he felt traumatized by the fact that it was his job to draw this girl. And yet, you know, there was something kind of futile about that act of witnessing. So in the poem, he says, if seeing her for an hour before her last, weak cough into all blackness, I could yet be held by white chalk walls and by the great ash-colored bed and the pillows hardly creased, by the tapping of her little cough-jerked head, if such can be a painter's ecstasy, her limbs like pipes, her head a china skull, then where is mercy? And the painter's ecstasy, I think, is this idea of him, getting the job done, capturing the scene, doing his work. But then it raises questions, what good is the artist if they are simply an accompaniment to death? What good is witnessing when it becomes a macabre type of voyeurism? And does it serve a moral end? So for me, this drawing and this poem by Mervyn Peake really touches on that. Sorry, John, how much time do I still have? You're on mute.
Maybe another 2 or 3 minutes after.
Oh, okay. Another way to make the work multivocal for me was to bring in the work of other people. So this is some work from Villawood, from our drawing circle by Murtaza, who also goes by the name of Mazhar, who did this amazing series of knots. And by talking about the art workshops in the graphic novel and including some of his work, and that's a scene there of him drawing. He had never drawn in his life, by the way, before 2011. So it was amazing to see him discover this, or rather tap into this skill that he has and really develop it. And so I tried to dilute the monological tone of the graphic novel by including examples of work that was not my own, the mark making, and the hand of other people. And then there are a number of visual references to the iconography, if you like, of migration. This is a play on a Ford Madox Brown painting called The Last of England, about English migration to Australia and English settlement of Australia in the 19th century. And so I feel as though Australians look to that very wistfully and with a lot of affection. I appropriated the image, but replaced the English migrants with Afghan refugees as a way of, if you like, subverting that image. I tried to do the same thing here with Max Dupaine's The Sunbaker. The figure I drew on the right is someone lying on the floor of the ship in exhaustion, part of the narrative of someone's boat journey to Australia from Indonesia. And the Sunbaker, since the 30s, represented the bronzed, strong body of the heroic Anzac, of the battler in Australian popular culture, and then became iconographic of beach culture more generally. So here I'm not trying to, if you like, expand or, admiringly enter the iconography of Australian nationalism, but to tweak it and redirect it to tell other stories and for other means, And so there's a number of pop culture references. Again, thinking of the battler, this is my main character, Haida, who also does kickboxing. Here I've referenced Raging Bull. Rocky's the same pose. Reference to German woodcuts go throughout the book, particularly the expressionist style, black and white woodcuts. And on the left here is an example of that made in an internment camp in South Australia by Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack, who was a German internee during the Second World War. I feel like this Second World War visual references are important because that was the time when the scaffolding of human rights is consolidated after the Second World War, And it was also the time when Australia practiced internment and locking up perceived enemy aliens, particularly Germans or Italians who were suspected of supporting fascism when actually they were the people who were escaping fascism. And that was why most of them were in Australia and working in Queensland in the cane fields and that sort of thing. And another visual reference, just before I end, there's some more black and whites, is the language of horror and monster theory. I think the language of horror and monstrosity has always been very good for thinking analogously about racist thinking and the process of othering. And so I try to bring that type of theory and aesthetic into the book. Here's an image inspired by a cover artwork for a death metal album by Morbid Angel called Altars of Madness, the artwork by Dan Seagrave. One of those records I loved as a kid. And so here I've replicated that image to create this ball of, pain and grief. Reference to a horror film, Hellraiser, when I'm talking about how we can't fall into political despair over this issue. And then there's the Australian government comic, horrible wordless comic, which is supposed to deter refugees, which I've also used as source material, again, with the intention of taking this absolutely terrible piece of propaganda and using it for something good, turning it around, using its imagery to fold into a narrative which is hopefully more truthful and multi-layered. This comic contains all of the misconceptions of the Australian government. And finally, there's a bit of history in the book because I really did want to show that racism is structural and that Australian refugee policy is a consequence and an extension of the colonial state, and not simply, the terrible ideas that some individuals have towards other people, and that Australia's refugee policy needs to be viewed in that context. So there's some history there too. Okay, I think I'd better wrap that up.
Thank you, Safdar.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. That was brilliant. Thanks so much. So we have time for a few questions, and I think we'll take a break up until 12 o'clock. But if you would like to continue the conversation, of course, you can always ask questions during the break as well. So if you have any questions, please write them in the chat and I'll ask them to Safdar.
Oh, shall I get off? I'll get off screen share. How do I get
I guess I can start with a question. So obviously, I mean, you've been working in the comics medium for a while, Safdar, and you talked about how it gives you like a chance to present all the subjectivities of yourself as the author and other people like Joe Sacco as well. So do you think this is a more effective way of talking about some of these issues that you're raising in Still Alive, say, compared to like a film documentary?
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, I feel like with the exception of Behrouz Boochani's film, which was filmed on a mobile phone that he had smuggled into Manus Island, you're not going to see any likely documentaries from a detention center because, of course, no recording equipment, no cameras, no phones are allowed into those centers. And the secrecy and censorship that surrounds the detention system is one of the reasons that Australia went right down in the World Press Freedom Index, because there is just this very high level of secrecy and lack of transparency, and passing the buck also when it comes to the responsibility for human rights abuses. So yes, I mean, a documentary would be amazing, but I think they're different things. I think the comic form and the type of self-referential graphic journalism that I was showing, for me, is powerful because, as I say, I think it's a bit more honest and self-reflexive than most other sort of conventional ways of doing documentary work. Something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten. I hope that answered the question. Yeah,
thanks for that. We have a question from Nico, who says, question 1 of 10,000. Guitar is brilliant. Love the crescent head. Is it intended as a flagrant symbol of Arabic resistance, to put it roughly?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, the guitar relates to the point of the band. So Hazine, the point of our band is that we're a sort of Muslim heavy metal band who are explicitly anti-racist. And so we satirize Islamophobia. And for that reason, I wanted a crescent shaped guitar. Yeah, because we want to toy with and subvert the sort of, popular symbols of racism and Islamophobia. So that's why it has that reference.
Thanks for that. Do we have any other questions for Safdar? Yes, so I'll read the question from Cameron. So he says, your use of extreme metal imagery got me thinking about how genres like black metal have been co-opted and used by racist and nationalistic groups, especially in Australia. thinking of that and also your reuse of the government propaganda, is there an element of resisting, fighting back against the more destructive uses of these mediums by racist groups, individuals?
Yeah,
I hope that makes consumer sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about reclaiming those traditions. I agree with many of the German commentators that thrash metal in the 80s was inherently left-wing and anti-fascist. And I think underground metal has that tradition. And I do think that some of the more kind of right-wing appropriation of this stuff needs to be refused by the general community. And so there is this very strong at the moment rejection of that and rise of so-called RABM bands, red anarchist black metal bands as well, which is all really important. You know, I think every community needs to reject fascism and racism and the symbolic appropriation of that, particularly because the far right co-ops cultural symbols in a very subtle way to communicate their messages. They use meme culture, they use Pepe the Frog, they use things which might appear very innocuous to freight their very dangerous ideologies. And that's a very sophisticated way that they bring new people into their ideology. And so I think people on the left need to use cultural forms in an equally sophisticated way to quite clearly reject and refute that.
Thanks, Safdar. I think we have one final question that we can ask you from Eric Thurman. Hi, Eric. Good to see you here as well. So Eric says, Safdar, truly thank you for one of the most thought-provoking presentations on graphic journalism I've seen. Outside of your recent work in Still Alive, is there any themes or topics you want to pursue in your work in the future?
Yeah, definitely. Probably stuff which is more personal to me, I think. I still want to do more autobiographical work because I still think there's a lot of things that autobiocomics are so good for addressing, you know. And in my own family, there was a certain amount of domestic violence when I was a kid. And that's stuff that I want to reflect on. I had a very angry father who had a terrible fly off the handle temper. And so I feel like there are experiences in my life which I want to connect to broader social issues, you know. And for me, that's what art is, a fundamentally communicative process. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot of potential to do work, you know, generally that addresses issues that matter to me. So I'm excited to do some personal stuff. I would re-emphasize that the Still Alive being a work of graphic journalism could not have happened without the experience of community over a decade that Refugee Art Project produced and the trusting friendships that it produced. So I don't think I'll do a journalistic work on that scale again, unless I do more sort of community engaged stuff, because I think that community model is the only ethical way to collaborate in storytelling, you know? It isn't extractive journalism where you just fly to some area, drop yourself into some community, get their stories, get out, write the story, never talk to them again, okay? So that's the kind of extractive journalism and witnessing which I don't want to be a part of. So I'm not sure if I'll do another work of graphic journalism again. I think this one is very unique to my experience over the last 10 years.
All right. Thank you, Safdar. Please join me, everyone, in thanking Safdar. You can use your reaction buttons if you want. And so now we'll take a short break. So if you want to get up, stretch your legs, get a coffee or tea or something, and we'll be back around 12 o'clock for our next panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.